Welcome everyone to the webinar, Pups and Packs, Saving Wolves in 2022. It's a pleasure to see so many people joining this webinar. We have nearly 100 attendees right now. This webinar is being recorded and will be saved on PIER's YouTube channel, which you can access through our website at pier.org. And is being made into a podcast by Peak Environment, which can be found at studio809.com. We will provide more information at the end of the webinar, and follow-up emails to the attendees will contain this information. My name is Tim Whitehouse. I'm the Executive Director of PIER, or Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. PIER supports current and former employees who seek a higher standard of environmental ethics and scientific integrity within their agencies. We do this by defending whistleblowers, shining the light on improper and illegal government actions, working to improve laws and regulations, and supporting the work of other organizations. Protecting wolves from slaughter is a top priority of PIER in 2022. Let's get started. I'd like to turn this over to Hudson Kingston, PIER's litigation attorney, who will be moderating this event. Hudson?
Right, thank you, Tim. Hi, everyone. My name is Hudson Kingston, and as Tim said, I work with him at PIER. I'll be moderating our wolf policy in 2022 webinar. I'm happy to be able to join this great group of panelists in talking to you about an important and pressing policy issue. In recent years, since the Trump administration's efforts to entirely delist gray wolves from federal protection, several states have adopted policies of mass hunting and eradication of wolves, where they had only just recovered a foothold. Our panelists today will discuss federal, state, and tribal approaches to wolf management and ways that policy could be improved in the coming year to reverse some of the damage that has recently been done. Thank you for joining us to learn more about the history and science behind failed federal and state policies to protect and conserve wolves, PIER's efforts to get the Department of Interior to deny funding to states that allow illegal hunting of predator species, and a discussion of better wolf policies based on science and indigenous knowledge. Together, we can press for better policy at the federal level, creating conditions under which wolves and other predator species can fully recover from near extinction. Next slide, please. Great, so I'm just gonna introduce our wonderful speakers and then get us going so we have time at the end for questions. First, we'll be hearing from Dave, who is a retired Fish and Wildlife Service biologist, where from 1990 to 1999, he led the service's efforts to reintroduce the endangered Mexican gray wolf. Also, speaking after Dave, Chandra is the head of the Rocky Mountain PIER office and has been working in coalition with groups like the Center for Biological Diversity and Global Indigenous Council to push the Interior Department to do more to protect wolves and other predator species. Next slide, please. Following Chandra, we have Adrian, who is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and director of the Carnivore Coexistence Lab, where he recently led research on misleading fact claims about wolf killing. And then finally, finishing off our batting order, we have Peter, who is a wildlife biologist with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, where he assists Glyphwicks member tribes in the implementation of their off-reservation treaty reserved rights, and has a broad experience in conservation of more than human beings, such as wild rice and wolves. We will be saving your questions until the end. You will not be able to unmute yourselves to ask those questions, but please do write them into the Q&A box, and we will get to as many of them as we can after these four great speakers are able to do their presentations. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dave, who is going to start off with the next slide.
Thank you, Hudson. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I will be discussing some of the history of wolf recovery. Historically, there may have been as many as 2 million gray wolves distributed throughout what is the United States, what is now the lower 48 states. Could I have the next slide, please? Yes, thank you. The red wolf, which evolved in North America, occupied that south eastern region that's not blue in that slide. Gray wolves migrated to North America by traveling across the Bering Land Bridge, connecting Northeast Asia to Northwest North America. Scientists believe gray wolves crossed the bridge in 3 different waves. Following European colonization, gray wolves were actively persecuted for nearly 400 years. The first wolf bounty was enacted by the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630 and paid 1 penny for each dead wolf. Bounties and wolf persecution by various methods, including poisons, proliferated. In 1915, Congress appropriated $125,000 to the U.S. Bureau of Biological Survey to be used for predator control. In 1931, Congress passed the Animal Damage Control Act, which provided authority and continued funding for control of mammalian predators, rodents, and birds. Prosecution of wolves continued until they were eradicated from most of the lower 48 states by the mid-1940s. Only a few hundred wolves remained in the remote lakes region of northern Minnesota when the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973. Gray wolves were listed as an endangered species in 1974. Recovery programs were initiated for regional populations of gray wolf subspecies in the northern Rocky Mountains, the western Great Lakes region, and the U.S. Southwest. Wolves colonized the northern Rocky Mountain region by natural dispersal from Canada into northwestern Montana, and by physical reintroductions of wolves captured in Canada and released into Yellowstone National Park and central Idaho. Wolves recolonized the Great Lakes region by natural dispersal from northern Minnesota and Canada. Mexican gray wolves were reintroduced from captive stock bred from just 7 surviving founders. Next slide, please. Federal implementation of gray wolf recovery has been flawed in many ways. The first major flaw is that the Fish and Wildlife Service failed and apparently was reluctant to develop a range-wide recovery plan as required under Section 4 of the Endangered Species Act. Thus, every attempt to delist wolves on a regional basis has been overturned by litigation, challenging the legal sufficiency of proposing the delisting of only a subset of the listed entity. Section 7N of the Endangered Species Act allows any person to file a lawsuit to obtain judicial review of any decision made under the Endangered Species Act. Congress was wise in adding this provision, as nearly every advancement in gray wolf recovery has been forced by citizen-initiated litigation. States became increasingly frustrated over failures to remove gray wolves from federal protection. In Montana and Idaho, those frustrations and the re-election aspirations of Senator John Tester resulted in Senator Tester inserting a rider in the Department of Defense Appropriation Act of 2011 that permanently delisted gray wolves in Montana and Idaho. Tester's rider contained language that prohibited judicial review, meaning that you could not file a lawsuit over that provision. The second major flaw in gray wolf recovery planning was to establish low bars for meeting delisting criteria. For example, the Northern Rocky Mountain Recovery Plan delisting criteria called for just 30 breeding pairs and at least 300 wolves for all of Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and the western portions of Washington and Oregon. Few, if any, conservation biologists would agree that these criteria are sufficient for long-term recovery and persistence of gray wolves in the 5-state Northern Rocky Mountain region. The Endangered Species Act establishes 2 primary purposes. The first is to provide a means whereby the ecosystems upon which endangered and threatened species depend may be conserved. And the second is to provide a program for the conservation of endangered and threatened species. Few people realize that the ESA has a primary objective of conserving ecosystems. But the Fish and Wildlife Service has never embraced the ecosystem conservation objective of the Endangered Species Act. The third flaw is that the Fish and Wildlife Service typically bases recovery criteria on minimum viable population, defined by the demographic and genetic criteria for preventing extinction, usually over something like a 100-year period with a 90 to 95% probability of avoiding extinction. No consideration is given to the ecological roles or the evolutionary potential of restored population. Wolves are apex or keystone species in their ecosystems. They exert top-down effects that cascade down through every trophic level in the ecosystem. This effect enhances biological diversity and general ecological health and stability. Minimally viable populations for ensuring only survival and demographic persistence are insufficient for restoring the ecological roles of keystone species and evolutionary processes. Dr. Michael Soule, founder of the Society for Conservation Biology, defined the concept of ecologically effective population, requiring sufficient abundance and distribution of keystone species through their natural habitats to fulfill their ecological roles at landscape scales. The Fish and Wildlife Service has never considered ecologically effective recovery recommendations. Applying this standard to the Northern Rocky Mountain population would result in recovery recommendations at least 10 times the current recovery objective and quite likely higher. What's the point of recovery if it falls short of restoring the ecological function and evolutionary potential of species? It seems equivalent to establishing a wild zoo or safari park to exhibit native species. What's the status of gray wolf recovery today? Trump administration enacted a final rule on the 4th of January, 2021, removing all gray wolves except the Mexican gray wolf from protections under the Endangered Species Act. This, even though gray wolves had only been restored to less than 15% of their historical range and only a small fraction of their original numbers. And despite overwhelming public, scientific, and political opposition, and scientific peer reviews commissioned by the Fish and Wildlife Service, which found that the delisting proposal ignored best science and appeared to reach a predetermined conclusion with inadequate scientific support. Hundreds of wolves are being slaughtered by all types of cruel methods, authorized by the state wildlife management agencies of Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and Wisconsin. Wolf hunting in Wisconsin was temporarily halted in 2021 by litigation after the disastrous 2020 hunt that killed 216 wolves in just 3 days. Slaughtering of wolves continues in the Northern Rocky Mountain region, including at least 20 wolves that ventured outside the safety of Yellowstone National Park into the crosshairs of hunters just outside the park boundary. More lawsuits and petitions have been filed challenging the validity of the Trump delisting rule and calling for an emergency 240-day relisting of gray wolves by the Biden administration under the authority of Section 4B7 of the Endangered Species Act. To date, this Fish and Wildlife Service, under the direction of Martha Williams, has openly supported the scientific validity of the Trump administration's delisting regulation and has not issued an emergency relisting order. To end on a positive note, the state of Colorado is developing plans to restore wolves following the passage of a citizens' ballot initiative in 2020, which forces wolf recovery in Colorado. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Hudson. for the introduction. I see there are 108 people here today. Wonderful. So great to get a chance to talk to you all. Next slide, please. Just one second. So as you have heard from Dave, there are about 2,000 gray wolves in the northern Rockies. The majority are in Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. And lucky, gigantic Alaska has between 7,000 and 11,000 wolves. On January 4th, 2021, the Trump administration removed the last of the Endangered Species Act protections for gray wolves. And I want to note that 1.8 million comments were submitted by the public opposing the delisting. So these are quotes from people in Colorado. My office, the Rocky Mountain office, is here in Denver. These are some of the diverse opinions of the state in the state on wolf policy, and these are the types of thoughts that are mirrored across the country. The last wild wolf was likely killed in Colorado in 1945, but as Dave said, in 2020, a group of 6 was documented in the northwest corner of the state. We do think that several of this group were since shot in southern Wyoming. It is not legal to kill wolves in Colorado. Gray wolves are classified as endangered under state law. But 2 years ago, the voters in Colorado passed legislation to initiate the reintroduction program to bring back the wolf. Next slide, please. Hunting wolves is legal in Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and Alaska. The Fish and Wildlife Service is counting on state game management agencies to maintain healthy and sustainable populations. However, in the past year, state legislatures, not game agencies, have taken matters into their own hands. Idaho and Montana passed legislation in contradiction to federal goals, as did Alaska in 1994. States are authorizing controversial hunting practices: baiting, trapping and snaring, shooting wolves and pups in dens, aerial spotting, then land and shoot, nighttime hunting practices with artificial lights, and year-round hunting on private land. Next slide, please. So in Idaho, the wolf population was almost completely gone until they were reintroduced in 1995. The issue has always been political there. The legislature, not the Fish and Game Department, set the minimum population level at the low level of just 15 packs. Last May, the Idaho legislature passed a law authorizing the killing of 90% of the state's wolves. They want to allow 1,300 out of a population of approximately 1,500 wolves to be shot. In Idaho, you can buy an unlimited number of wolf tags. In fact, the state is paying bounty hunters. You can get up to $2,500 for killing a wolf in Idaho. In Wisconsin, after the delisting, a state court ordered a wolf hunt. In 3 days in February, hunters in Wisconsin killed 218 wolves. So the entire state population has decreased between 27 and 33% from the 2020 numbers. The current wolf hunt has been stopped by a state court, and there are 2 pending federal court cases. Next slide, please. So in Montana, the Yellowstone wolves are endangered. Let's see. I have the wrong. So last month in December, the Yellowstone Park Superintendent, Cam Scholey, wrote to the Montana Governor, Greg Gianforte, asking him to shut down hunting and trapping in the area for the remainder of the season. Scholey cited the extraordinary number of Yellowstone wolves already killed this hunting season. Just 2 weeks later, on January 1st, 20 wolves were killed along the border. The Phantom Lake Pack is now considered eliminated after almost all of its members were killed. As of January 1st, 150 wolves have been killed in Montana. Next slide, please. So this dark wolf in this slide is the alpha male of the Phantom Pack, number 1106M. So this is one of the wolves that may have been killed in this last slaughter. Next slide, please. So the public is calling for change. In recognition of these rapid population threats, in September, the Fish and Wildlife Service said it would begin a year-long process to examine if the federal endangered species protection should be restored. But is that fast enough? One option available is an emergency relisting of the wolf as an endangered species. A group of 21 US senators wrote to Interior Secretary Deb Haaland urging for an emergency relisting. Nearly 80 members of the House have called for an emergency action. What other options do we have? Next slide, please. In 1937, Congress passed the Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Act, also known as the Pittman-Robertson Act. The Pittman-Robertson Act authorizes a federal tax on the sale of guns and ammunition. The revenue goes to state fish and game agencies. The money is supposed to be used on projects related to wildlife, conservation efforts, and shooting education programs. Since 1937, over $10 billion have been awarded to the states. In late September, PIER and 30 other groups submitted a rulemaking petition to Interior Secretary Haaland. We've asked her to disqualify states with out-of-control predator programs from receiving federal funds. How can this be successful? Pittman-Robertson funds are a significant portion of state game agency budgets across the country. In 2021, approximately $1 billion in federal aid was funneled to these state agencies. Consider that last year, the State Game Department of Idaho received more than $18 million in federal funding. Last year, the Montana Game Department received more than $24 million federal dollars. These funds are supporting state programs that are in direct contradiction of federal goals. Pittman-Robertson funding should be contingent on states meeting federal standards for wildlife conservation. Next slide, please. This slide is the regulatory amendment that we've proposed to the Secretary. The statute already requires that states can't compromise healthy populations. So this proposed regulation reinforces that. Also, our proposal incorporates a public comment period in the decision to distribute funds. This allows all of us to participate in the process. This includes conservation groups, hunting groups, tribes, tourism, scientists. All of the public could be part of the process. We're calling for a transparent, open process. Next slide, please. This slide is the draft policy memorandum that Secretary Haaland could adopt. We've proposed a new tool for the Secretary. Interior would have an annual opportunity to consider the impacts of new state legislation. They could consider new state management practices, changing population numbers, developing science, and comments from the interested public. Then, taking that into account, the federal government can decide how to distribute Pittman-Robertson funds to the states. Over 15,000 members of the public signed on in support of this effort. At the end of October, Secretary Haaland was scheduled to meet with the Global Indigenous Council, our coalition representative, to discuss this proposal. And she had a last-minute schedule change. We have not heard from her since. Next slide. How you can help. Let Secretary Haaland know that you are counting on her to save the wolves. Ask her to use Pittman-Robertson funds to compel states to protect native predators. Ask her to issue an emergency listing of the gray wolf as an endangered species. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this webinar. Thanks to the folks at PIER for their support. It's a great organization. I'm here to talk about research on the state of the science about liberalizing wolf killing. By liberalizing wolf killing, I'm talking about governmental policies that either make it easier to kill wolves legally or incentivize wolf killing. And this research was done in collaboration with Dr. Jeremy Bruscotter of Ohio State University. What I want to be clear about is that we're going to be talking about a specific kind of research done around the world, because gray wolves occur in northern latitudes around the planet. And in a lot of places, governments kill those wolves, make policies for legalizing and liberalizing wolf killing. And along with those policies, a lot of governments make assertions of fact or fact claims about why they're killing wolves. So the research I'm going to talk to you about today is an evaluation of those fact claims, not the value-based arguments that some governments make. So when a government makes policy, say, to kill wolves, they sometimes will provide value-based claims, such as we don't like wolves, or they'll make fact claims, such as killing wolves protects human safety. And sometimes governments will tangle the two together. And what scientists can do is disentangle those, but we look only at fact claims. So I'm not going to be talking about the value-based judgments in today's talk, just the state of the science about the fact claims that are marshaled by governments around the world and are being touted right now by state governments in Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, and Wisconsin today. Next slide, please. So in this table, I've arrayed on the left column the 4 most common fact claims made to justify wolf killing around the world. The first one is it might protect human safety. Second one is wolf killing might protect wild game populations like deer and elk. The third one is wolf killing might protect domestic animals such as farm animals or livestock. And the fourth common one is that wolf killing might raise tolerance for the surviving wolves among human populations. In other words, people might like or tolerate wolves better if they're allowed to kill them legally. So these are fact claims. This is in the wheelhouse of scientists like myself and Dr. Bruscotter, and we can look at a deep and wide scientific literature of peer-reviewed scientific articles evaluating these fact claims. So let's look at this, starting with the middle column, where there's basically no evidence because there's been no scientific study of the effectiveness of wolf killing to protect human safety. There are a large number of anecdotes and incidents where humans have felt threatened or been threatened or injured or attacked by wolves. And sometimes those wolves are killed, but those are generally not subject to scientific study. And moreover, those conditions now are exceedingly rare. So the risk of human attack by wolves is extremely low worldwide. The conditions for it are almost never met, being things like rabies, starving wolves, or people feeding wolves out of their hands. Given that those are exceedingly rare conditions, it seems like a very strange justification for the widespread wolf killing that's going on in the 4 states I mentioned earlier and that we are talking about in this webinar. Second, what's the evidence that killing wolves is going to protect wild game populations like deer or elk? Well, the evidence is very mixed, but the scientific consensus is that factors like habitat quality, climate, and disease are the strongest influences on the populations of things like deer and elk. In fact, the latest review by Drs. Clark and Hebblewhite of this question of predator control indicates that it's highly variable whether it's going to help the wild game populations to kill predators. And there are even cases where killing predators like wolves can actually harm the game populations. So the jury's out on this. It's quite mixed. But clearly, if states wish to protect their wild game populations, they should be thinking about habitat quality, wildlife disease, and mitigating climate change. Those are the major influences on wild game populations. Number 3, here the science is entirely clear. Over 24 scientists from about a dozen countries have reviewed all of the scientific evidence from around the world. And if we focus in on wolf populations and liberalizing their killing, we actually find the evidence is quite clear. The majority of studies agree that killing wolves had no effect on protecting farm animals like livestock. In a minority of cases, killing wolves actually improved livestock survival subsequently, and a minority that's equal or larger, killing wolves actually made the situation worse and livestock losses increased. The scientific consensus here is unambiguous that legalizing or liberalizing the killing of wolves does not protect livestock. It can, in fact, worsen the situation for them. And the best available evidence comes from studies by Dr. Francisco Santiago Avila, studying Michigan's wolf lethal control program, and Dr. Oksana Grantis, studying France's lethal control program of wolves. All right, finally, what's the evidence for human tolerance improving after liberalizing wolf killing? Well, there's no peer-reviewed scientific evidence in support of this. In fact, a series of longitudinal studies of human attitudes among people living inside and outside of wolf range, as policies for killing wolves changed from more liberal to less liberal, those longitudinal studies, which resample the same individuals over time, asking them the same questions as policies changed for liberalizing wolf killing, showed that tolerance for wolves actually declined, and behavior that reflects intolerance, namely illegal killing of wolves, actually increases significantly when governments loosen protections for wolves. So the scientific evidence I find unequivocal. Dr. Bruscatter agrees with me. It's unequivocal now that human tolerance doesn't increase with liberalizing wolf killing. It's been repeated so often that many agencies believe it a fact. They think local tolerance might increase, but they don't have evidence for it. So let me pause here and repeat that these are the 4 most common fact claims for so-called societal benefits of killing wolves. This is very separate from value statements, such as a government might say they like wolves or they dislike wolves. Those are value-based statements scientists can't evaluate. There's also a whole set of statements about societal costs and benefits. States often trot out reasons for killing wolves based on costs for, say, livestock losses. But we also have to look at the benefits to society from wolves, and research from Wisconsin is shedding increasing light on that. Next slide. So among the societal and ecosystem benefits that are being detected for wolves come a number of studies that speak to the possibility that wolves are going to reduce the spread of zoonotic or wildlife diseases. Zoonotic diseases are those that can be transferred between humans and non-humans, but also control of wildlife diseases such as chronic wasting disease might be improved by the presence of apex predators such as wolves. We also find evidence that the presence of wolves on the landscape increases the biodiversity of several types of organisms, including scavengers, and including understory plants and forest biodiversity. Studies in Wisconsin show that within the centers of wolf pack territories, some endangered understory plants are doing better. That's research by Dr. Callan and her colleagues. We also see research by Dr. Don Waller and his colleagues in Menominee County, Wisconsin, showing that forest structure, regeneration rates, biodiversity, and resistance to invasive plants is improved when wolves are present on the landscape. We also have interesting preliminary results. They need to be replicated, suggesting that counties that contain wolves have fewer deer vehicle collisions, with the resulting loss of human life, loss of deer life, presumably loss of wolf life in these in these on high-speed roads. That research is intriguing, was published last year in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Dr. Jennifer Rayner and her colleagues, and needs to be replicated elsewhere, although similar findings for cougars and deer in the Northeast US suggest that this might be a widespread pattern. And so I'd like to just conclude by saying that the fact claims made about wolf killing do not seem supported by the scientific evidence, and that's the best available evidence from peer-reviewed scientific literature in the best journals in the world. And therefore, Dr. Bruscotter and myself call upon states to stop misleading the public with these fact claims and instead be transparent about the value claims that they're making for these policies for liberalizing wolf killing. Again, I want to thank Pierre and my fellow panelists and for your kind attention today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would also like to thank Pierre very much for the opportunity to be here, and it is an honor to be part of the panel here today. And thanks for everyone who's tuned in. In the next 10 minutes, I'll try to give you a quick overview as I can and give you a little bit of perspective on the Ojibwe's worldview towards Mayangan, or the wolf. So for starters, why am I here? Next slide, please. I work for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, or GLFWC, which is an intertribal organization made up of 11 Ojibwe, also known as Chippewa or Anishinaabe tribes. And these tribes are all co-signatory to particular land secession treaties in which they reserved certain use rights from the lands that they ceded. Although there was an extended period of time when these off-reservation rights were not recognized, they have been reformed in court cases in past decades, going all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And as you'll note, there's a tremendous amount of overlap between these ceded lands and current wolf range in the Western Lake Superior region. Next slide, please. The Ojibwe have a powerful and ancient relationship with Mayangan, one that goes all the way back to their creation story. Part of this story explains that when original man found himself lonely, the creator responded by providing not a woman, but a wolf to walk and to talk and to play with. And the creator then sent the two of them out to visit all of the earth's places together. My tongue in cheek on this is the original road trip. But if you've done a long trip with someone, you tend to get to know them very well. And certainly original man and Mayangan grew incredibly close to each other. They understood the beauty in creation, the unique relationships that existed, and the relationship that existed between them. And this has often been described as a brotherhood, or even something more intense as being one and part of the same being. And so, original man and Mayangan must have been surprised when they went back to the creator after finishing this assigned task and were told, next slide please, that they were to go their separate ways, but their fates would be forever intertwined. And understanding this, I think, is essential to understanding the Ojibwe's worldview towards Mayangan. I think it's clear there's many examples where these parallel fates have actually occurred throughout history. With some of the obvious ones being that both Mayangan and the Ojibwe have been hunted for their hair. Both have been subject to drastic population reductions. Both have been excluded from large areas of lands they once occupied. Not all of the examples, however, are from long ago. Next slide, please. For example, the reaffirmation of treaty rights in Wisconsin and wolf recovery in the state actually happened in a remarkable synchrony. Wolves entered the state the same year that treaty rights reaffirmation case was instigated. And true to the teachings, many state residents saw both of these events the same way. There was a cohort of people who saw both of these as positives, as restoration of culture and ecology. But next slide, please. Many people saw these both in a very different light and contended that both wolves and tribal members were going to decimate the natural resources of the state and needed to be stopped. Wolves, of course, initially struggled to get established in Wisconsin, and the tribe's initial efforts to recover their treaty rights were met with great opposition as well. Fortunately, the gunfire that was killing wolves and gunshot wounds were the #1 cause of mortality, despite the presence of Endangered Species Act protections. They were at least fortunately aimed over the heads of tribal spearers, and the pipe bombs that were found in boat landings were discovered before they went off. As a Wisconsinite, I was not proud of my home state and the overt racism that came to the surface at this time. But as bad as it was then, I really shudder to think what it would be like if this was unfolding under the current political climate we have today. And as we all know, these false perceptions still ring true in many people's minds. Next slide, please. Fortunately, over time, treaty rights were reaffirmed and the regional wolf population grew substantially. And you can imagine what that means to people who understand that their fate is tied to that of wolves. To see this tremendous recovery and to see wolves reoccupying some of their ancestral lands over large parts of the ceded territory. You can also imagine, next slide, please, the horror and the disgust they felt in February of this year, when, as has already been described, in the middle of the wolf's breeding season, well over 20% of the state's wolf population was slaughtered in just 63 hours, with no biological justification. And the only political justification being given was that we damn well better kill them while we can before they go back under the Endangered Species Act. Next picture, next slide, please. So how do the Ojibwe apply these long-held beliefs and understandings today? Before I answer that, I want to go back to the treaties one more time. Treaties, we are told, are the supreme law of the land. Next slide, please. But now I'm not talking about the land succession treaties, but the original treaties. The treaties that the Ojibwe made with the beings that they depended upon for survival, like Mayangan. Like any treaty, there are responsibilities on both sides. Wolves taught the Ojibwe how to survive on what is often a harsh landscape, how to hunt, to have stamina, to work cooperatively, and importantly, how to raise young and extended family groups. They also kept the deer herd healthy and helped maintain populations of important plants, including medicinal plants that many tribal members still use. The Ojibwe needed to view the wolf as their brother, to treat them with respect, to think of their best interests, and to be appreciative and humble in accepting the benefits that wolves provide. And the Ojibwe not only still respect these treaties, but next slide, please. They have joined many other Native American nations in reaffirming their responsibility to wolves today. And this is the treaty with the wolf that has been led by the Global Indigenous Council. And you can see many indigenous communities that have signed on to this. Now, for our member tribes, I think the primary expressions of this responsibility can be boiled down to a handful of primary points. Next slide, please. Excuse me for all the text on here. I know I'm violating good PowerPoint presentations, but there's a lot of ground to cover. The primary points are, I think, first of all, again, that the tribes recognize their dependence upon the ecological and the cultural benefits that living wolves provide, and they remain thankful in accepting these gifts. From a population perspective, they support allowing wolves to establish their own population level and range on the landscape. They oppose the recreational hunting and trapping of Mayangan. And they prefer preventative and non-lethal approaches in response to livestock depredations. Targeted lethal control has been deemed acceptable under limited and necessary conditions. Next slide, please. So you might say, where's the science in this? Is this just a different cultural worldview? Well, I'll just reiterate Adrian's points that the needs commonly given to justify wolf seasons really don't hold up to scientific scrutiny. And there's more and more data to back that statement up all the time. We also know that Mayangan numbers are always low and functionally self-limiting and don't need to be controlled at the landscape level the way some species do. And then finally, the ecological and the social benefits of wolves provide to society at large are really far greater than the negative impacts they occasionally cause some. And so, in short, I think that the science suggests that the need to hunt wolves is frankly on about par with the need to hunt eagles. And ethical considerations, I think, of both tribal and non-tribal communities teach us that killing without need is immoral, even if the population that's being killed can numerically withstand it. Next slide, please. So is this an unreachable goal in our current climate? I actually don't think so. I used to say that there was no area where the perspectives towards conservation were more different between the state and the tribes than in the realm of wolves. But I think I was wrong. In fact, here in the Midwest, at least, and I think actually in many other parts of the US, the perspectives of the general public and the perspectives held by our member tribes actually have tremendous overlap. The problem is that state natural resource agencies don't listen to the general public, but to the folks who are buying hunting and fishing licenses. And with political gerrymandering, this is becoming increasingly true of politicians as well. And I think that's why state DNRs badly need different funding mechanisms so that they can better steward the natural resources that are entrusted to them and legitimately fulfill their trust responsibility to the entire public, not just to special intergroups, and can legitimately fulfill their government-to-government responsibility when working with Native American tribes. Next slide, please. And with that, I will just say miigwech, or thank you, and I'll gladly join the other panelists in taking your questions.
All right, thank you, Peter, and thank you everyone who had the time and expertise to present for folks today. Right now, we're gonna go straight into the Q&A, and if you haven't yet, feel free to type your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen there. Upvote questions that you would also like to see answered. And if we don't have time to answer some of your questions, then please, of course, feel free to email me at hkingston@pier.org, and I can get answers to your questions. To go to some of the ones that Chandra has already answered in the Q&A box, a few folks had already asked if we were going to share this information for follow-up activities, and we definitely will. You'll get a copy of all the slides, and you also will get access to Adrian's recent research and other useful links that you might want to use. So don't worry about that. That's definitely coming out after the webinar. But just launching right into it, I know that we had a couple questions while Adrian was talking. One about if there were studies on chronic wasting disease in wolves, which I believe was answered by the presentation itself. But there's another one that's, what are the mechanisms such that killing more wolves harms livestock? Would you be able to field that one, Adrian?
Yeah, sure, Hudson. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah, so a quick comment on the CWD issue. There have not been the necessary studies to evaluate wolf predation as a means of slowing the spread of CWD, not yet. They're just suggestive studies and some modeling. And for other diseases, top predators like wolves, including wolves, have been shown to control other diseases. The mechanisms by which killing predators, killing wolves might lead to higher livestock losses. Terrific question. The short answer is we don't know the biological mechanisms yet because the proper experiments haven't been done. What we need are randomized controlled trials with placebos to compare livestock herds that are protected by lethal methods versus livestock herds that are not protected by lethal methods. However, we don't have those studies yet. What we have are before and after comparisons, both in the case of Michigan and in the case of France, to look at what happens to the same herds after wolves are killed. And both for Dr. Francisco Santiago Avila and Dr. Oksana Grant found a majority of cases in which there was no change in livestock losses after killing wolves. In a minority of cases, there was an improvement. It was safer for the farms and locations in which wolf killing occurred. And in a minority of cases, it was riskier for livestock in the region after wolves were killed. The supposed mechanisms, the scientists are hypothesizing two possible mechanisms. One is that killing a member of a wolf pack, which is a team, right? Wolf packs are teams. They cooperate in defense of their territories. They cooperate to reproduce and defend their pups. They cooperate to hunt. That's a team. And a team doesn't work well when you remove essential and integral members of the team. So one hypothesis is that you've killed a couple or 3 or 4 members of the team. It simply doesn't function as well. So the remaining surviving wolves turn to the most predictable food source on the landscape, which is livestock in our region, because they're in small fenced pastures that can be found year-round often. The second hypothesized mechanism scientists are throwing around is that once you destroy part of this wolf pack team, the neighbors come in and challenge, and the neighbors will eliminate the survivors from the pack that the state killed. And those newcomers are also going to go for livestock until they establish themselves and figure out where the wild prey are, because wild prey are less predictable, harder to find, even though they're the preferred food of wolves around the world. Thanks for that great question. And I invite Peter and David to add anything I've forgotten, or Chandra.
Well, we have a lot of questions, so I'm gonna plow ahead. Dave Parsons, we have a large philosophical question. Can you please explain, and also political, can you please explain to me, us, what forces are pushing against wolf protections at the federal level? I understand the various state issues that explain the horror of their policies, but what in the world is holding up the federal government? I am dumbfounded and so terribly saddened.
Well, yeah, thanks for giving me the softball question.
Right.
Yeah, having worked in the agency, I have seen firsthand the influence of politics on the agency. And by and large, that influence comes from the states, who don't have the same goals as the federal government for recovering predators. Many states have programs to eliminate predators to boost game populations. So there's tremendous pushback from the states. Sometimes that elevates to the level of getting letters from state governors opposing meaningful wolf recovery. It also leads to politicians who are sympathetic to the views of the states, putting pressure on the federal government to push back on liberalizing recovery goals. And states are also players on recovery teams that set these goals in the first place and seem to have a disproportionate influence in that process. And then there's just the general timidity of the leadership at the federal level to push back on that, to live up to the objectives of the federal legislation for protecting endangered species, and quite frankly, to follow the law, which is why they often end up in court so often. I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave. For Peter, do you have any recommendations on how wildlife advocacy nonprofits can better coordinate with the tribal nations on wolf conservation?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a challenge. You know, there are a lot of different tribes, so who you coordinate with and at what level is always a challenge, I think. And there's always an issue with tribal governments that their staff tend to be stretched very thin to begin with. But you can reach out to tribes and to their natural resources departments and to their leaders. It's always important to talk to tribal governments and not simply tribal members. And I think the other thing that can be valuable is just to remember to always demand that the state also reaches out and embraces their responsibility to work on a government-to-government relationship with the tribes. I will say that I think this has changed a great deal over the course of my career, and the level of cooperation going on between NGOs and the tribes is greater than it's ever been. And it's probably more important in this arena than just about any place I can think of.
Great, thank you, Peter. Chandra, you've had a lot of questions and you've answered a lot of them already, but I wanted to invite you to answer both, sort of bring people's attention to the materials that you presented about Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And then we also had a question about the Pittman-Robertson petition and what part of Pittman-Robertson allows the Secretary of the Interior to revoke those funds. So I guess I'm throwing two questions your way and you can answer them however you'd like.
Great, thanks, Hudson. And yeah, thank you for those questions. So on the Colorado Game Department, so it's been controversial, the wolf reintroduction in Colorado, in that the majority of the voters live in the area of the state, which is not where the wolves are located. And so there's this, I think, perception that that the people who will be living near the wolves don't have as much of a say. And so they have got a few advisory committees together, which to represent that area of the state more heavily. And I wanted to point out Pierre's work in this, in which we represented a whistleblower from the Colorado Game Agency, who was asked by his manager to develop materials that would incriminate a couple of the conservation appointees for the Wolf Advisory Committee. And that employee refused and was able to, he ultimately stepped down from his position. And the manager, and so he became a whistleblower with Pierre, and we had quite a bit of local press, the Denver Post and the Daily Sentinel, and the Colorado Sun covered this also. And ultimately that the Northwest Regional Manager was moved to a different job. I think now he is managing a shooting range. But the employee who stepped down, unfortunately, is no longer an employee for the state. So you can read about that on Pierre's website, or I'm happy to share more with you on that. And then as for the Pittman-Robertson legislation, you should go check out our petition, which is also on the website, the rulemaking petition, and you can read the citations to the law, and we can talk to you about that more if you'd like also.
All right, great. Let's sneak one more in. I know I'm going a little bit over, but Peter, opposing recreational hunting and trapping is appreciated, but how is that different in your mind from what would be ceremonial, spiritual, or religious hunting in accordance with tribal ceremony and under treaty protected rights?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question and a complicated one. At a superficial level, one way they're very different is just the scale of them, right? We under our tribal codes, our tribes have not allowed the general hunting of wolves. We do have the opportunity or the potential use to harvest a wolf for ceremonial purpose. I am not aware of that actually being done amongst any of our member tribes, and it would be a very unique situation that goes very directly to cultural and religious beliefs. I think that what it comes down to in a way is what is your motivation for hunting and what is the purpose for it? And that taking of a wolf's life requires substantial justification. And I think within a religious context, there may be certain times when that might be deemed reasonable or appropriate. But that's very different from the recreational sport hunts we see which really largely come down to being done simply in truth to be a trophy opportunity. It's an experience to kill an animal that perhaps a person hasn't killed before. And most of the other justifications that have always been given don't hold up. So it's a difficult question. I'm a biologist and not a theologian, but I hope I at least helped a little bit with that.
I thought the answer was excellent. Folks, we are at time, and you should definitely feel free to email me at hkingston@peer.org with any burning questions you still need answered. We will be providing you with the recording, and this will be presented in a podcast, so you can listen to it at your leisure and brush back up on all these great wolf facts. And of course, you can feel free to jump on the PIER website and donate if you are interested in supporting our work on wolves in the coming year. I will be handing it back over to Tim after saying thank you to our amazing panelists for sharing your knowledge with us. Tim, there you are.
I'm here. Yep. Thank you, Hudson, very much. I guess I wanted to thank you, Hudson and David, Parsons, Adrian, Chandra, and Peter for your presentations. It's very distressing to sit here and listen to what's happening and to hear what's happening to wolves throughout the country. But this work is so necessary, and we're committed to it in the coming year. As others have mentioned, we'll be following up with all of you with an email on how you can engage yourselves and sending the webinar links, both for the recording and for the podcast, as well as how you can contact elected officials to voice your support for reforms. So thank you very much and have a wonderful day. Bye.